Hello and welcome to our Wednesday webinar from the IEA Clean Coal Center. My name is Benedicta and I'm part of the communications team here. Our monthly webinars are based on our technical reports, which are available from our website, www.iea-coal.org. Residents of member countries and employees and sponsoring organizations can download our reports at no charge after a one-off registration. Today's webinar is about how to reduce mercury emissions in Indonesia, presented by Dr. Leslie Sloss. I should just say you can type in any questions you have as we go along, and Leslie will answer them at the end of the webinar. Over to you, Leslie.
Thank you, Benedicte. Hello and welcome, or as they say in Indonesia, selamat pagi, selamat datang. And thank you very much for tuning in for the first Clean Coal Centre webinar of 2021. What I'm going to do today is give you a quick update on a project we're leading on behalf of the US Department of State. First of all, a quick reminder of who we are. We are a technology collaboration programme under the auspices of the International Energy Agency. We're a not-for-profit source of unbiased information on the clean use of coal. And as Benedicte has just said, please do visit the website iea-coal.org and register free of charge. And then we'll be able to send you updates on our publications, blogs, webinars, conferences and workshops. So today, in the next half an hour or so, I'm going to run through the background to some work we've been doing. I will move on to the results, letting you know how you can then get involved in phase 2 of this exciting programme of work. Remember, as Benedicte said, there's a function on the webinar screen in front of you that allows you to ask me questions. So as we're going along, if there's anything that's not clear or anything you want more information on, please do send me a question and I'll try to get that sorted at the end of the talk if I have time. If not, I'm more than happy to email with further information. So first of all, background to the programme. Why are we doing this? Well, mainly because we received funding from the US Department of State. They are particularly interested in providing capacity building in emerging Southeast Asia to focus on reducing mercury and other emissions from the coal utility sector. The project has two parts, one in India and one in Indonesia, and today I'm going to be focusing on the Indonesia project. Time is limited, so I'm only going to be giving you a quick overview of the work. However, please be reassured that there is a full report on phase 1 of this work that will be available very soon on the Clean Coal Centre website for all interested parties. There is also going to be a more detailed discussion of the work at an online event we will be running in March. And at that, which will be a more interactive webinar, we will have presentations from important Indonesian stakeholders and a discussion of how this work will inform real policy changes and promote real remedial action in the coal sector in Indonesia. So please do check out the website for more details, and we will be emailing you a link to that event. And I'll provide more details at the end of this talk, just as a reminder. So first of all, why is this work necessary? Indonesia is determined to bring adequate electricity to all of its growing population within the next decade. And this is a population of over 70 or 80 million people who are spread over more than 17,000 islands, many of which are actually quite remote. It really is an island nation, and therefore getting electricity out to remote regions is quite a challenge. They currently have over 28 gigawatts of coal plant in place, and that delivers just over half of the country's power demand. They plan to double this coal capacity within the next 10 years, which sounds like a daunting target. However, if you look at the graph on the left there, you can see that the country's already more than doubled the coal capacity in the last decade, and therefore probably has more than enough means to keep doing that or increasing their coal capacity. However, what's important to note on the graph on the left is that the government is rapidly moving to HELI technologies. HELI are high efficiency, low emissions options. This means improving and increasing the proportion of supercritical and ultra supercritical plants in the fleet, as shown there in red and green on the graph on the left. And from now on, the plan is to be, for most, if not all plants, supercritical and ultra supercritical plants. They do plan to expand their solar, geothermal and wind. However, as we know, a reliable baseload capacity is required for sustainable economic growth, and therefore coal does provide more of a reliable baseload than most of the VRE technologies do at the moment. And of course, coal is indigenous to Indonesia and is seen as intrinsic to the country's future. And so as coal usage increases in Indonesia, so will emissions from the sector, as shown in the graph at the right. In blue, we see the predicted increase in coal use. In red and green, we see the estimated mercury emissions from that increased coal use. The red and the green values vary depending on what emission factor was used to estimate the emissions, and I'll discuss that more in a moment. However, there is clearly a correlation between the amount of coal burned and the amount of mercury released from that coal burn. And as coal use increases in India, so will the mercury emissions unless something is done to reduce or decouple that effect. Now, Indonesia has ratified the Minamata Convention. The Minamata Convention is set up by the United Nations to control and, where feasible, reduce emissions of mercury from all human activities. And coal is one of the major sources of mercury emissions to the atmosphere. Mercury causes developmental delay in infants and at high doses in adults too. It generally comes through eating fish and through the food chain. And so the accumulation of mercury in the environment is of great concern to most of the nations. Indonesia, as I say, has ratified the Convention on Mercury, which requires it to take two actions with respect to emissions from the coal sector. First, on the left there, it must create and maintain a sectoral emission inventory, which means it just must evaluate how much mercury is coming out of its coal sector and must keep an eye on how much that increases or decreases into the future. And on the right there, it must take action to control and, where feasible, reduce mercury emissions by creating a national action plan that will focus on emissions from the sector. And that is what this project is about, is helping Indonesia evaluate the mercury emissions and determining a national action plan to reduce those emissions. Now, the Minamata Convention contains clear guidelines on how compliance should be achieved with different mercury emission sources. Within Article 8, there are requirements for actions specifically at coal plants, and the plants are divided by age, determined by the date in which the relevant party ratified the convention. So for Indonesia, it means that a new plant is anything built after September 2018, and these plants must have that BEP, that is Best Available Technology, Best Environmental Practice, installed by September 2022, which of course is not that far away. That BEP is defined within the associated guidance document shown here on the left. It's a free download from the Minamata website. And that BEP is described, as I say, in this document, but it's not prescribed. The delegations themselves must determine what emission reduction techniques and technologies are most appropriate to their plants, and cost can be taken into account when considering what is best in each region. Now, for Indonesia, as we saw in the previous slide, the majority of new plants being installed are HELI technologies, these high efficiency and low emissions. There are also more stringent emission limits for SOx and NOx in new plants. This means that most, if not all, of the new plants being built these days are going to have SOx and NOx control technologies in place. And these will result in co-benefit reduction of mercury in many cases. And so it can be argued that new coal sources in Indonesia could already be compliant with the Minamata Convention. Obviously, that would need to be evaluated and defined. But what I'm saying right now is, since most of the new plants are going in HELI situation with tighter emission factors, we're not worried about them under the National Action Plan so much as we're worried about the existing sources. Many of the existing fleet is a fixed unit. It's all the plants that have been in operation up till now, up until the September 28 switch date. And these have until September 2027 to comply with the convention. So it's a little bit longer, but it's still in the sort of next 5, 6, 7 years that Indonesia has to take action against these plants. Now they have an option, a list of options for how they can comply with the Minimatic Convention to reduce mercury. They can put in a quantified goal, a qualified goal, such as 30% reduction within 5 years from the whole fleet, or perhaps 20% reduction at one plant and 50 at another, as long as it's qualified and determined and written within the action plan. They could set an emission limit value for these units. Now, there actually is a mercury emission limit value in Indonesia for mercury. However, it has been set recently at 30 micrograms per cubic metre, which is an order of magnitude more lenient than the MATS rule in America and the EU emission limit value. So it's really not much of a challenge. Most of the plants in Indonesia would already be in compliance with the emission limit. However, obviously now that that emission limit is in place, there are monitoring requirements in place, and it's very feasible that the emission limit value could be tightened in the future. Existing sources can also put in the BAT-BEC. They can come up with the best available technology, best environmental practice. That could be fuel modifications, fuel blending. It could be increasing efficiency of the plant, or it could be putting in technologies such as FGD, DNOx systems, or even a sorbent or oxygen specifically for mercury control. It is defined on a plant-by-plant basis. The fourth option is a multi-pollutant strategy, and that actually makes more sense for the existing fleet in Indonesia. Most of these units have only ESPs in place. Very few have FGDs and DNOxes. And so for the Indonesian government to suddenly set a requirement for mercury control before they've set anything for SOx and NOx just doesn't make sense. And so it would be wise for them to come on with a strategy to install technologies where required that will tackle more than one pollutant at the same time. And finally, there's this sort of wishy-washy or less defined alternative measures. And what that basically means is burning less coal, maybe fuel switching or fuel blending, co-firing waste or biomass, or closing down the plants. Anything that gets you to control where feasible reduce emissions. So although there are various options listed here for the existing fleet, what it really means in practice is that either less coal burn at these units or action taken to reduce these emissions, which means control technologies or a clever reduction strategy. So how will Indonesia determine what strategy or technique to use to define an effective national action plan? They have to fully understand the emissions from the coal fleet. And that is what this project aims to do. It is running in 3 phases over 3 years, and we've literally just completed phase 1. So this is what I'm going to be talking about today. However, I will be calling upon experts, hopefully many of you sitting out there listening to this, to feed into phase 2 of the project, and I'll mention that more at the end. So phase 1 is effectively applying the requirements of the Minamata Convention to the existing fleet in Indonesia, producing an emission inventory and determining potential emission reduction strategies. And by doing this, we will be choosing 3 plants we believe to be representative of the fleet to look at emission reduction strategies for those plants. In phase 2, we will be providing data on these 3 plants and coming up with our own projects and strategies, but also reaching out to international experts to see if they have any ideas for what control technologies or strategies could work within Indonesia. And in phase 3, we hope to deliver a catalogue of proposals for compliance to the Indonesian government that they will use to inform their national action plan. So phase 1 is to evaluate emissions from the Indonesian fleet. For this, we have looked at over 111 units of plants over 100 megawatt in size. I think there are actually over 200 units in Indonesia, but only about 100 or so of those are over 100 megawatts. This means collating information of all those plants to crunch through the numbers to estimate mercury emissions for each individual unit. The ultimate aim is to then rank the plants in order to identify which plants emit the most mercury, as these plants would clearly be the most appropriate for the application of an emission reduction strategy under the National Action Plan. So in practice, we're creating the basis of an emission inventory, and from this we hope to develop a potential national action plan. So first of all, the data collection, a lot of numbers collected in an extremely large data set. We, as I say, focused on the units over 100 megawatt in size, although the other smaller plants are listed in this data set, and that includes over 100 units. We are focusing on the larger units as they are the plants that are more likely to be larger capacity, a larger utilisation rate, and therefore more likely to be contributing to the mercury emissions for the region. And also the larger plants are the ones where cost-effective emission strategies are more likely to be successful. Excuse me. So we collected as much information as we could, COVID willing. We started this in January and it ran until July. The data set is huge. We have over 70 fields of information for each of the units, including the major factors listed here in this graph. We had actual coal chemistry for the coals and the coal blends being used at most of the plants. As we gathered this information for a study we carried out in conjunction with the US Geological Survey on behalf of the UN Environment Programme in a project we did back in 2017. And we updated as much as that information as we could. For the coal, we had obviously the calorific value, the ash value and so on, but we also had the mercury, sulfur and chlorine content, which affects the chemistry and the behaviour of mercury in the plant and is very important with determining how much leaves the stack and how much ends up in the ash. There were some data gaps which we filled from other published sources. However, where we've used proxy data, we've marked those on the data set as being proxy, so it's clear which ones are not actual data and which are estimates or best guesses. We've recorded how the calculations were carried out and we had them approved by the Indonesian stakeholders. The data set, as I say, is huge. We're not going to be sharing it. It is proprietary, some of the information, and it remains the property of the Indonesian government and the US Department of State. However, as we move into phase 2 and 3 of this project, if anyone specifically needs more information on the plants we are studying, we will hopefully get information to release more information as it becomes necessary. Okay, so moving on to data analysis. It's important to understand the major differences between this study and most other sectoral emission studies. The majority of emission inventories you will see out there are top-down. That means you're taking an emission factor for a general national coal in most cases, combining it with a retention factor that's a reflection of how much mercury is retained within the ash or the gypsum from the plant and doesn't come out of the stack, and then using an activity value such as the total amount of coal burned to produce an estimate of mercury emissions from the whole fleet. And this is the way the UNEP toolkit defines how to do it under the Minamata Convention. It provides a generic emission factor, a table of those, and if you look up that table, this is the emission factor you will get for Indonesia. Provides a generic retention factor based on ESP only on most of the plants. And then of course you multiply that by the amount of coal burned in Indonesia, and that gives you your mercury emissions from the fleet. In 2017, we carried out a project, as I say, on behalf of the UN Environment Programme, in which we went in and we analysed the coal so that we got an emission factor that was more accurate for the Indonesian fleet. We also used our IPOG model, which I'll talk about in a minute, to predict a more accurate retention factor for the mercury within the plant. And then, rather than multiplying that with the coal burn, we actually calculated the emission factor based on the plant output, taking the calorific value of the coal into account. So this adjusts for the variation of plant efficiency, as we know that some plants are significantly more efficient than others. And it also compensates for the variation in coal quality, the high ash coals and low ash coals, so that we know how much mercury is being emitted for the amount of power produced, rather than just the amount of weight of coal going into the plants. So these two approaches, as I say, those are top-down approaches. So you're multiplying the total for the fleet as a single entity. However, for this study, we're using a bottom-up approach. We're using coal analysis for each individual unit, retention factors for each unit individually, and finally activity values for each unit individually. As with any bottom-up approach, this compounds the overall error if you're producing an overall estimate for the fleet. But that's not what we're doing. Our aim is simply to produce a ranking of the fleet to see which plants are more of a concern than others. Now, this is the IPOG calculation tool, which I have mentioned in the past. There is a webinar on this available through our website and through the Coal Partnership website of the UN Environment Programme, and I can send you that link. Oh no, it's actually down the bottom there. If you go to that site, you can download this little Excel tool. Your computer won't like it. It is an exe file, so beware, but I can promise you it is, once you've downloaded it, it is very useful. It comes with a very important user manual so that you understand what data is being used and how best to use it. And what this is a very user-friendly interface which lets you type in your coal chemistry as much as you know. If you have a lot of detail, you can put that in specifically. If not, you can choose a generic high sulfur coal. You put in, it's almost like a Lego brick build, an indication of your plant configuration. So you'll choose the boiler size and configuration. You can put in low NOx burners or not. You can choose an ESP or a baghouse. An FGD can be slotted in there. It takes less than 3 minutes for most plants to put this information in. You press the go button, and in the top right there, it will give you an estimate of mercury emissions from your plant. Obviously, it's science, it's not magic. It's based on data. It's based on data collected through the information collection request of the US EPA several years ago, and it's been augmented with data that we've collected from Asia, Africa, and Russia. So there's a lot of numbers behind there, over 3,000 mass balances from actual plants. However, obviously, it still remains a best guess, and we would not recommend that this is used for defining the control strategy or the emissions from any plant. However, it's a very useful tool when you don't have any access to the plant in question. Okay, so we number crunched. We have the coal characteristics from the study we did with the USGS. So we have the coal emission factor specifically for each unit. We have a plant-specific retention factor that we've estimated from using the IPOG tool, and of course we have the plant utilization rate that we got from the Indonesian stakeholders, how much it's running, how much power it's producing, and so on. And so there are two ways of ranking the information we get from that. We can look at current emissions, which are interesting, but they provide a very uninformed snapshot. Plant A and Plant B may be emitting the same amount of mercury per year, but if Plant A is going to close in 2 years and Plant B is going to run for another 30, then obviously Plant B is more significant with respect to any reduction strategy. What is more useful is the emission intensity. That's the amount of mercury emitted per gigawatt hour of electricity produced. And that's going to identify which plants are burning more cleanly than others. And that's what we produced. And then we combined this emission intensity with the expected remaining lifetime of the plant to let us know which plant will emit the most mercury before it closes. Now for this, we assumed a 40-year life plan for all the plants. However, this is just one field. If we want to change that to say a 25-year time plan, it's a simple change of the calculation within the data set. And this is something the Indonesian stakeholders may want to play with in future, determining the effect of closing down higher emitting plants earlier than others. Within the calculation, we also assumed that all plants would continue to run at their current capacity and utilisation rate. Again, this is something that can be changed within the data set should the Indonesian stakeholders wish to consider their scenario of operation. So finally, let's get on to some actual results. I'll just let you look at this for a couple of seconds while I have a glass of water. This is our fleet emission intensity. So what we have here is the unit size of the plants we studied, ranging from 100 megawatts to over 800 megawatts, and their predicted emission intensity, that is the amount of grams of mercury they are predicted to emit for every gigawatt hour of power produced. Obviously, your eyes are being drawn to these two outliers on the left here, where either the data is very wrong or these plants are burning in a very unclean manner. And I'll talk about one of those later. However, if we focus at most of the well-behaved plants that are remaining within our normal zone of operation, we can see that for the most part, the emission intensity is not directly related to plant size. We have clean burning and not so clean burning plants of all sizes. And even within this sort of well-behaved sector of the data set, it's clear that some plants are emitting almost an order of magnitude more mercury per gigawatt hours than others. And clearly those plants should be cleaned up or used less than the others. This average line along there is not the average of the Indonesian fleet, although it looks like it is. This is actually the average emission intensity of US plants reported in the early 2000s. I think it's dated from 2004. So this is showing how cleanly the US fleet was burning before MAT's mercury and air toxic standards ruling and before the application of mercury controls across the US fleet. It's just included to show that the Indonesian fleet, has pretty similar mercury emission intensities to the US fleet. So they're not burning any cleaner or more dirtier than any other plants in any other fleet. However, what is important is that some units genuinely seem to be emitting an order of magnitude mercury per gigawatt hour than others, and that is a powerful piece of information. So using that, crunching it with the remaining lifetime of the plant, the annual utilization and so on, we get the data for total mercury emissions over the remaining lifetime of each of the units in Indonesia. Now, as I say, there are over 100 units, over 100 megawatts. However, I've only included the top 30 here because the graph gets very boring if you follow it down to the right. Obviously, those in the right would be far lower emissions and far smaller or far older plants. What is interesting, however, is the top 10 units on the left of this graph here are emitting over the remaining lifetime around 47%, so almost half of the emissions from the whole of the Indonesian fleet combined. So here's your argument that sometimes it's more cost effective to hit a few units with emission control technologies rather than prescribing a blanket requirement for that across the fleet. So to take action against these top 10 will be expensive, but it'll be significantly less expensive than rolling out sorbents across the whole fleet in a blanket strategy. Suralaya, if you look here, is featuring very heavily in the top 10 units. That's because Suralaya are big units. These are large plants. They're relatively young, 20 years or younger, and they're running at high capacity. Suralaya is providing most of the power to the Java Bali region. Now, I've included on here as well the yellow dots. Those are values for the lifetime sulfur emissions from these plants, just because that information is actually very helpful when you're looking to determine mercury control strategies. For example, Suralaya, on the right there, most of the units we can see have high mercury emissions in red, but they also have high sulfur emissions. And so a strategy for controlling emissions from these plants would be a multi-pollutant one, where you'll be reducing sulfur and mercury simultaneously, maybe through an enhanced FTD or sorbent system. For Cirebon, on the far left here, high mercury emissions because it's a young plant running at high intensity. But it has relatively low sulfur emissions, and so perhaps a more mercury-focused strategy could be advisable. Obviously, this needs more investigation than just my current musings, but the indications is that the co-benefit controls could be beneficial for most of these high-emitting units, as they're emitting high concentrations of both mercury and sulfur. Now, there are 12 units within Indonesia that are currently installed with FTD, either wet limestone or seawater. Now note the limit that on the left there, the amount of emissions of mercury coming out of these plants over the remaining lifetime again. We're talking over 3 tons over the remaining lifetime of these plants, which if we go back to that plant, would actually put them up with the top 10 emitters of the fleet, which is surprising. For those of us that know their FTD system, we would expect mercury to be effectively controlled in a high-performing, normal-performing FTD system. Mercury is usually captured because in its oxidized form, it's quite soluble. However, we have to remember that we haven't measured this data. This is modeled data based on the cold chemistry. And these plants are predicted to emit a high majority of elemental mercury, which is not easily captured in an FTD system. And so predicted this elemental mercury will pass through this FTD unscathed. Now, before Indonesian stakeholders take any action against these FTD units, obviously we would insist that they did actual mercury monitoring to ensure that our model is correct. However, if it is the case, then it's very interesting that the mercury is not being effectively captured in this FTD. And I'm sure as a lot of you out there know, a simple addition of perhaps some oxidant or some chlorine or a blending of the colds, there's ways of easily enhancing the mercury capture in an FTD system that could be very cost effective with these plants. Okay, so as I say, for phase 3, we want to select 3 plants for closer study. We want to choose plants which obviously have high mercury emissions, but we also want them to be representative of the Indonesian fleet. If we simply choose three plants, the top three plants, then we're going to end up with two Suralias, which are identical, and a Cirebon, which is also very similar. We would rather choose plants which are distinct and different, so that when we cut and paste any successful reduction strategies, we have a higher hit across the entire Indonesian coal fleet. We are awaiting confirmation from the ministries on the plants that we've selected. However, I can give you an indication of the plants that we've proposed. Obviously, we have chosen the Suralaya plant because it has, out of the top 10 plants, I think 4 or 5 of them are Suralaya units. The top emitters, because they're running at high capacity, they have relatively high amounts of sulfur and mercury, and they're high utilization rate, obviously, and they're 20 years old or younger, so they're going to be running for a long time still to come. We're hoping to work with unit 5, 6 or 7, but the units are very similar, so it won't really matter which one we choose. It will be up to the plant which one they're happiest for us to work with. We also wanted to choose that Python one, unit 2, the one with the Seawater F2D system that is emitting as much mercury as a plant without FTD, which of course is surprising. Obviously, we want to go in and verify that that estimate is right. And if it is, we want to look at potentially enhancing the mercury capture in that system. Now, seawater FTD systems are becoming more common in places such as Indonesia, which have significant access to significant amounts of coastline. Indonesia, as I said, has an island nation. There's an awful lot of sea about to be used in a seawater FTD system. Seawater FTD systems are ideal for sulfur capture, as they use the natural chemical characteristics of seawater to capture the sulfur emissions, and the seawater can be released back out into the environment. This is more of a concern when we're looking at mercury, because some of these plants are in beautiful coastal locations such as Bali, and we want to ensure that if we do come up with a project to reduce mercury emissions into the air, we don't simply end up increasing the mercury emissions into sensitive aquatic ecosystems and beautiful coastal beaches. And finally, our third plant is the one that everybody's eyebrows raised at earlier. That is the unit on the far left there, the top high value, which is emitting orders of magnitude more mercury than any of the other plants in the fleet. It didn't appear in that ranking graph I showed you because it is small, it's below 100 megawatts, and because it's imminently due for closure, so its remaining mercury, its remaining lifetime is 0. However, obviously that plant is not running particularly well. It's using mine-mouth coal, and it's running very inefficiently. What is exciting and interesting about this plant it's currently being closed and is due for upgrade by the utility that operates it. And so this works in our favour, as it potentially gives us access to a plant as it goes through an upgrade and modification progress. Hopefully we'll be able to get our hands dirty and ensure that any changes made to this unit will improve its efficiency in operation, but will also take mercury into account in any of the modifications being applied. So moving on to call proposals and how you can get involved. We have a March 2021 event that Benedicta will mention in a moment, and which will be on our website very soon, that you can register for. And at that, we'll be providing more details of the study. We'll be hearing from our Indonesian stakeholders, the Ministry of the Environment and Energy and Mineral Resources. And we will be looking to describe in more detail the 3 plants that we propose to work with. And we will be asking for you to work with us to come up with suggestions and proposals for techniques, technologies, strategies and policies, anything that can be put into a national action plan to reduce mercury emissions from this existing group of plants. We will then compile a catalogue of all the proposals and present this to the Indonesian government to inform their national action plan. And I can confirm that the Indonesian government, the stakeholders we're working with at the moment, have agreed to use our information and our proposals to inform the National Sectoral Action Plan. They're more than happy to have experts such as you and I guide them on how best they can comply with the Minamata Convention, which is very exciting. So my major conclusions are that it's exciting to look at the mercury emission intensity of each plant on a unit-by-unit basis, because it does give us so much information about which plants are of most concern, and it allows us to focus on the plants which are higher emitters and those which we know are going to be running for a long period of time or at high capacity. And as I say, we've chosen 3 plants for closer studies, confirming which ones they are, but we know there's going to be a standard subcritical unit with an ESP, probably Suralaya, a plant with Seawater F2D, probably Python, and this Minamata plant on Balloon, which is due for upgrade. So we will disseminate this information after the online event in a call for proposals. We are then hoping to have an actual MEC, as anyone that knows the Clinical Centre knows, we have an annual workshop called MEC, Mercury and Multi-Pollutant Emissions from Coal, which moves around the world. Obviously it didn't happen last year due to COVID. It would be great to think we could have it in Jakarta late this year or early next year, and that's what we're hoping to do. And should that be possible, we will build in site visits to the selected units to let you get out there, look at these plants and come up with site-specific proposals for reduction strategies, which we'll include. If COVID doesn't let us do that, we'll come up with some other online way of doing it, but fingers crossed for getting us out there and getting our boots dirty on the ground. Now, phase 3 of this project, we're looking to find funding. Now, there is funding within this grant that we're using to find funding. There's not funding for a project, but there's funding to find funding for a project, if that makes sense. We will be reaching out to funding sources and to see if we can come up with money for a demonstration project or for some other means of coming up with a mercury reduction strategy that we can test in practice. However, it's important to remember that Indonesia is actually ratified the Minamata Convention. Therefore, it has until 2027 to come up with its national action plan and to move things into action. And so even without external funding, some form of action is compulsory within Indonesia anyway. We are providing the guidance to them, and so I'll be very surprised if we don't see some of our ideas moving to fruition within the next 5-6 years. So we'll see you in March online. We will chat over coffee. This is a photograph I took at the Suralaya plant in Indonesia when we were out there a couple of years ago. It's a beautiful plant, lovely utility, if you can call a coal-fired power plant beautiful. Some of us like engineering, some of us don't. This is a coal hopper that apparently the plant manager was getting fed up with people saying that it looked like a coffee grinder, so he just made it look like a coffee grinder. Kind of cute. We will have this event online on the 23rd, 24th and 25th of March. It will be 2 or 3 hours a day, tuning in, presentations from us and the Indonesian stakeholders, and a chance for some roundtable discussions and questions. And as I say, at that time, we'll give you the update on all the project work and we'll provide more details on the call for proposals. So this is not the call for proposals. The call for proposals will come in March and more information will come at the online event. Finally, a quick mention of our knowledge partner. If anyone's intrigued at what we're doing, it's not just a study in Indonesia we're also doing CIB work in India, lots of other projects. So we've created a networking group known as our knowledge partners. It's an informal association which just facilitates the sharing of information and results on how to reduce the environmental impact of coal and to enhance energy security in many regions where coal is readily available. So if you are a knowledge partner, you receive information on our current and future work and therefore have the potential to leverage some synergies in terms of overlapping areas of interest and project work. It doesn't cost you anything to join, so please do get in touch if you want to see your logo up amongst these other wonderful companies and organisations. So thank you for listening. I will now try and work out how to look at the questions. Let's see if anything has come in. The questions are not showing at this time, which is very strange as they were showing it earlier. So here's a question. If someone does not have access to actual mercury coal characteristics or the IPOG, is there any way of ranking coal fleets and determining a national action plan? So I think the question is, can you come up with a national action plan without doing coal chemistry and spending an awful lot of money? Well, yes, you can, I believe. In fact, I think I've got an extra slide. Here we go. Yes, this is what we did, which we called gross ranking of the plants. And what we did was look at each of the plants, took the data from the data set to look at the capacity of the plants, the remaining lifetime, the operational load, the mercury content, the efficiency of the plant, and we color coded them. Very simple. So if it's a big plant, a high capacity plant, it gets a dark red because it's a dangerous big plant, therefore high emissions, whereas smaller plants would be green because they're less of a threat with respect to emissions. Ones with high operational loads obviously have a darker red. Those with higher mercury would have higher red. And by combining these color codings and giving them a number, you can actually rank plants without knowing how much mercury is in their coal at all. You can just know that any plant running high capacity for a long period of time is likely to be emitting more of everything than others. And that's a simple way of determining which plants are going to be more appropriate to a national reduction strategy of any emissions, not just mercury. So I shall try to go back to the questions. Do I know how the seawater is treated before releasing it into the sea? No, I don't. As far as I'm aware, there's very basic, well, that's the wrong word to use, there's sort of screening of it, and there's flocculation of some kind in some cases, and there's sieving, which I'm sure there's a better technical term for sieving. It is treated, but not in any way that would remove the mercury, as far as I'm aware. So as far as I know, Seawater F2D systems currently release mercury straight into the sea. So obviously mercury is in the sea, so it's not really of that much of a concern if it is dilute enough. However, it depends on the movement of water in the local area. If we're releasing increased quantities of mercury into our bay area, we would want to know the dilution rate, how much of that is being spread out, the tidal zones and so on, before we would consider whether that was good. And we know that there are sorbents and additives you can put into an FTD system that could perhaps capture the mercury in a solid form that we could filter out. I guess that's where that question was going. That's the only question I'm seeing. And I'm already at 40 minutes, and I'm sure you've got lunch to get to. So if you do have any further questions, I'm very good at replying to emails. My email address is leslie.sloss@iecoal.org, or email the website, and I will get back in touch with you as soon as I can. And also remember, I'm more than happy to provide further questions at the online event in March, and it would be great to see you there. Thank you very much, and I will pass you back to Benedicte now.
Thank you so much, Leslie. That's great. As I mentioned before, there is a page, a sign-up page ready for everyone interested in participating in this online event in March. We'll include the link in our follow-up email. And the slides from this webinar will be available to download from the webinar page of our website shortly. The next webinar from us will be on Wednesday, the 17th of February at 12 p.m. On advances in carbon products from coal, and will be presented by Dr. Ian Reid. Thank you all for joining us today, and goodbye.